Hey there, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made my router table complete with a homemade DIY fence and plenty of bit storage. Stick around because the video's coming up. So I've been wanting a router table with a router lift in my shop for a really long time. I just think router tables are very versatile. You can do a lot with them. And so I've been actually designing my own table, but in the meantime, John Malecki actually came out with his router table, which is the exact same as what I was gonna design. So I'm just gonna use his build plans. If you want to follow along, make sure you go and download his build plans. I've linked it in the description below. They're really inexpensive and very easy to follow. So make sure you go and check those out. So to start up the build, I broke down all of the sheets of Baltic Birch Plywood. I'm using 2 sheets of 3/4 inch Baltic Birch and 1 sheet of 1/4 inch Baltic Birch just for the bottoms of the drawers. I used my circular saw and my straight edge just to get a rough cut so they'll be more manageable on the table saw, and obviously using some styrofoam so I didn't cut into my assembly table. During this process, my daughter, or the forewoman, like I like to call her, had to come and check on the new project. She loves getting up on the assembly table. Obviously, I don't run any power tools while she's out here, but it was really fun to have her in the shop. Kisses. Bye. Once she was done inspecting everything, I kept going on breaking down all of the sheets of plywood and then finally moving them over to the table saw and getting them cut to their final dimensions. On a project like this, it's really nice to have an outfeed table. I don't know what I would do without my outfeed table. If you haven't seen that build, I'll link it in the description below. Make sure you check it out. As I cut everything, I made sure that I marked it based on the build plans so that I knew what part it was as I was assembling the whole table. Next, it was time to work on some pocket hole joinery. That's what this whole build is going to be made out of pretty much, is pocket hole joinery and some Titebond 2 glue. So here is a segment of me drilling a ton of pocket holes. After the pocket hole frenzy, it was time to get the carcass all assembled. I added a little bit of Titebond 2 glue and attached the bottom of the cabinet to the sides of the cabinet using my pocket hole clamp and a parallel clamp to make sure that nothing moved. Once that was all set, I set all the screws in place and removed the clamps. After one side of the cabinet was done, I did the exact same thing on the following side. Hey, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I mean, you can maybe wait a little bit longer so you can tell if you like it or not, but don't forget to subscribe because I probably won't remind you again. Next, I moved the carcass to the ground so that I could work on it a little bit easier, and I added a couple stretchers across the top using, you guessed it, more pocket hole joinery and more glue. Then, to ensure I got my workout's worth, I moved it all the way back up to the assembly table and proceeded to get the dividers and the shelf put in. I used a couple spacers just to ensure I got even spacing across the full divider, and then I set everything in place with the pocket hole screws into the stretchers. I did the exact same thing on the other side, and then rested the shelf on the bottom of the dividers. The whole carcass is upside down, that's why the stretchers are on the bottom. It's just easier to work on it this way. I set more pocket hole screws, and then I flipped the whole thing back to the ground for one last workout. I cleaned up some glue that I had put on some of the plywood that didn't have a board connected to it, and then set my final bit of pocket hole screws. And here's what our finished carcass looks like. Next, it was time to work on our top. The top is made up of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch MDF. Both pieces of MDF are glued together, so I went full gallon bottle on this and just spread a ton of glue on there. And then I placed the other piece of MDF on top, clamped it all down, and used some straight edges to make sure that the whole thing got plenty of pressure all the way across it. Obviously, we're going to be cutting and routing a center hole for the router lift, so I wanted to ensure that there were no gaps and that I wasn't going to have any issues when cutting that. While the top dried, I got to cutting and assembling all of the drawers. Now this table is going to have a large long drawer on the bottom, a shallow long drawer in the middle, and then 2 side drawers that will hold bits and other tools and accessories that come with the router or the router lift. Now usually when I create drawers for my shop, I just tack the bottoms in place with some glue and some screws. But I decided to go with the method that John Malecki uses, where he cuts a dado and allows the bottom to drop in there and then sets a couple screws. So that's the method that I go with here. You don't have to do it that way, but I actually think it looks a lot nicer and they probably last for a lot longer. I'm not going to go too much into detail on the drawer assembly. There is a ton of good resources out there on how to learn how to do drawer assembly. If you know some great resources out there, make sure you tag them in the comments. That way other people can learn from the things that you've learned. Other than that, it's just simple pocket holes, glue, and a couple screws in each side. The back is about 3/4 of an inch smaller than the other 3 sides. That allows you to slide the bottom panel in and then set it with a couple screws, like I do right here. Once the big drawer was done, I did the exact same thing with the shallow drawer that goes in the middle. It's the exact same process. And with that, the 2 drawers were done. Next, it was time to get the side bit holders all set up. Now, I decided to drill all of the bits with my CNC. It just made it a lot quicker for me. You can do it with a Forstner bit, but the CNC gives me very evenly spaced holes for the bits, and it just made it go a ton quicker and made it so that I didn't have to drill all the holes myself. So at about this point, I had actually decided to put on some casters onto the bottom, but these casters were a little too wobbly, so don't use these types of casters. I would recommend some workbench casters, which you'll see later on in the video. Now the side drawer that holds all my bits is made up of 4 different pieces. It's made of a base, a shelf, the side where the drawer slides go onto, and then a back. Later on we attach a drawer front to it, but for right now we just assemble it with pocket holes and glue. I assembled it with a shelf that holds my 1/2 inch shank router bits on the bottom and my 1/4 inch shank router bits on the top. Really, you can set it up however you want to. I just thought that this was the best way for my needs. Next, I assembled the other side drawer, which will hold some of the tools that come with the router and the router lift. This has 3 parts. It has a base, a back, and a side. And I needed to set up some custom tool holders for all of these different parts. So I kind of laid everything out and measured where I wanted everything to go, and then just used some plywood scraps laying around the shop to make some pretty snazzy looking tool holders. To set them in place, I just put on some Titebond 2 and some CA glue and used some accelerator to get it to set quicker. I also added a stretcher on the side to make sure that these throat plates don't go flying off when I open the drawer. It also served as another place to connect the drawer front to, which you'll see later on in the video. Then it was time for my least favorite part of any woodworking project, installing drawer slides and drawers. I just don't like this part. But if you have to do it, I highly recommend doing it with the Rockler drawer slide jig. It really makes quick work of an otherwise long and tedious process. So go and pick that up. I'll make sure that I link it below. The drawer slides for the two side drawers is a little bit different. You add two drawer slides on one side instead of one on each side. I was actually really questionable on whether or not this was really stable, but it seems to work really, really well. I made sure I shimmed the drawers up with a couple 1/8" shims and then went through the exact same process of setting up the drawer slides. As you can see, the tool drawer is on my right, which means my router bit storage drawer is going to be on the left side. So for that drawer, I just repeated the exact same process using that Rockler drawer slide jig. Like I said, I cannot speak any ill words about this jig. It works phenomenally and really makes this a quick and painless process. Next, I added a little bit of iron-on Baltic Birch edge banding. Normally, I really wouldn't care about adding edge banding like this, but because these drawers are going to be inlaid, you're going to see the edge of the plywood. So I really wanted to make everything flow together, and this edge banding will do the trick to cover up all of that plywood edge. I have a short on how to apply edge banding. It's super, super easy. You just iron it on. The trick to making edge banding stick is to use a little roller and press everything on. I find that using just the iron doesn't really help, so it's nice to have a little roller to make sure that everything sticks down and then clean up the edges with a chisel and a razor blade. After that, it was time to get working on the top and get the hole cut for the router lift. To start, I clamped it down to the cabinet and screwed it in place. And then I found the exact center of the top using a straight edge from corner to corner. Then I used the router lift as a reference to where I needed to cut this hole because, the router lift is the thing that's gonna go in the hole, so might as well use it as a reference. Now I need to route a ledge so that the router lift can drop down in it, but obviously doesn't go all the way down through the table. The ledge that I'm gonna route is about 3/4 of an inch. To make sure that I got that 3/4 of an inch, I use a 3/4 of an inch scrap piece of plywood to make a reference mark and know exactly where I was gonna be cutting with my jigsaw. I also added 45-degree corners just to give the router lift a little more support. And then I made sure to scribble exactly what I was going to be cutting out on this mess. And I thought that I had turned on the camera when I was using my jigsaw, but...
Oh, yeah, I forgot to do that.
Hey, if you can name that TV show and the episode, I'll send you a free Salt City Workshop sticker. Once I had the opening all cut with the jigsaw, I dropped my router lift down into it and began to make a template to route the ledge. Really, I'm just using some scrap MDF that I had left over from cutting the top. And then I used some of this double-sided golf tape, which is awesome to have around the shop. It's pretty much just double-sided painter's tape. It's strong enough that templates won't move, but it doesn't leave a sticky residue, and it's not so strong that it'll ruin your work surface. So I just made a template around the router lift and then pulled the router lift out of it. Then I used a 3/4 of an inch templating bit where the bearing is right next to the shaft of the bit. What this does is the bearing references the template and repeats the exact same cut down on the actual table. I only cut about a 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit more than a 1/2 inch down because that's as thick as the router lift is. You want to leave the router lift a little bit below surface because the router lift actually has some leveling feet which will bring it up to the level of the tabletop. So you can afford to be a little bit lower than the thickness of the router lift. And as you can see, it's pretty easy to pull the template off. The last one I had to use a little bit of a chisel, but the tape comes right off. And here's what the pocket looks like. So now that we're halfway through the project, I actually just got a new camera. I just picked up the iPhone 13 Pro, which has a phenomenal camera on it. And my intention is to actually just use that for all of my filming. So the second half of this video is gonna have some of the new footage on it. It'll be a little bit better quality, a Let me know what you think about it, and let me know if you have any tips on how to film effectively using a phone as your camera, and if you have any tips or tricks on what I can do to improve that. After dealing with these wobbly wheel casters, I decided to go with a workbench caster and a leveling feet option. I feel like this is the best option because sometimes those wheel casters aren't stable because the ball bearings like to move around. Here I'm installing the leveling feet, and I'll install the workbench casters later on in the video. Next, I wanted to add some T-track to the top of the router table. I needed to add 2 smaller sections so the router fence can have something to secure to. And then I needed 1 piece to go across the front of the table to be able to use with things like a miter gauge and a feather board, as well as some other router table accessories. To do this, I started out by marking exactly where I wanted the T-track to go, and then I routed the groove with my plunge router. I used the same double-sided tape and cutoff method to make a little bit of a template for my router to butt up against, and then I just plunged in and started going. It's super easy to route grooves like this in MDF. If it's anything else like hardwood or sometimes even plywood, you can run into knots or imperfections, and it is not as smooth of a cut as it is with MDF. So it's a really easy process. And once I routed the groove, I just made sure that I squared it off so that it matched the T-track using just a chisel and a mallet, and everything worked out perfectly. And then I did the exact same process with the long one that goes across the front of the table. Now, another fail on my part, I failed to show me actually installing the T-track, but I just used some CA glue and the screws that are provided to make sure that everything was secure. But before I did that, I sanded it all down to 220 grit, making sure not to take any gouges out of the top of the MDF because MDF is pretty soft. After that, I wiped it down with a shop towel and sprayed some water-based polyurethane over the top. I did about 3 coats of this, and it really made the top look super good and super smooth, which is what you want for a router table. The less friction you have on the router table top, the better. Once the top was all complete, it was time to get the faux fronts put on all the drawers. Now, I am not a professional on doing inlaid drawer fronts, but I've watched a lot of videos on it, and this is actually one of the first times that I've ever done inlaid drawer fronts. So what I did is cut them about a 1/16 of an inch smaller than the opening of the drawer that they're going onto. And then I wanted to add some drawer pull cutouts. Now, you're probably saying it would be much easier to cut these on the bandsaw. The thing is, my bandsaw is about 1 inch too narrow for me to be able to cut these on the bandsaw. So what I did is I created a template and used a flush trim bit to be able to cut these out and make them exactly the same on every drawer. Then it was time to get them installed, and yes, I do like to sit cross-legged on the ground. It's just much more comfortable to me, and I do know it looks kind of funny. But I used the playing card method that you see on so many videos. This truly is the best way to install inlay drawer fronts without running into any issues. The 1 or 2 times in the past that I have run into those issues, I didn't use the playing card method, but this made everything line up perfectly and gave me consistent gaps around the whole drawer front. If you want to see exactly how to do the playing card method while doing inlay drawer fronts, I've actually got a short video tagged above that you can check out. It's really simple and it gives you consistent results every single time. So once I got the 2 drawer fronts on the bottom drawers all taken care of, I did the same on the side drawers. These were a little bit different because screws are only going in from the sides, but everything seemed to work out great. Now, like I've mentioned a couple times before, we're using John Malecki's build plans here. He didn't actually build a router fence because he already has an assembled router fence that he used for it. But I have to build one. I don't really want to go out and buy a new one right now. So we're just gonna make my own, and here's how I did it. To start off, I glued 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood together to make up the back. These pieces were as long as the top of my router table and about 4 inches tall. This is gonna be the back part of the router fence. Once those 2 pieces were all dried, I marked where I needed to cut a slot for my dust collector port, and I cut that slot using my bandsaw. If you don't know already, the bandsaw is the newest addition to my shop, and it is super nice having a full-size bandsaw instead of that little desktop one, which I've been using for years now. After that was all cut out, I laid the piece on top of another piece of plywood, which would comprise of the base, and made some marks for cutting out the slot on the bottom and cutting it to the dimensions that I want the base to be, which is about 5 inches wide and about 36 inches long, which is the length of my table. I then marked where I needed to cut a slot for the dust port and then did that off camera. If you look, these are how the 2 pieces match up, and they match up really nicely with the dust port. The next thing I needed to do was route a groove for the pins to go through that will connect to the adjustable faces of the fence. To do this, I used some of my double-sided sticky tape on a sacrifice piece and then laid the fence down on top of it. If you look, I did drill 4 pocket holes across the top. This will be to secure the fence to the base, but I didn't want to put you through seeing me do more pocket holes. Once I got it all laid out, I marked where I needed these through dados or grooves or whatever you want to call them. I marked where they needed to go and began routing with my plunge router. I took 1/8 passes just to make sure that I kept everything under control. This jig is a lifesaver. It allows you to get directly in the middle of the board using the jig as a reference. My bit barely made it all the way through the 1.5 inch thickness of this fence, but it all worked out in the end just fine. Next, I attached the fence to the base using some wood glue and a little bit of CA glue and activator. I like to use this glue combo when I don't have a way of really clamping this thing together, but I need it to set quickly, especially with using pocket hole screws. If you put a couple dabs of CA glue and use some activator, it'll help the bond to set quickly, and then the wood glue will help to make sure that the bond is long-term. After that, I added some triangular short pieces just with some wood glue and nails, and I covered up those pocket holes, which I thought was a very nice touch. Next, I needed to make the adjustable faces for the router fence. These are made out of 3/4 inch MDF. Here I'm using my edge guide to create a dado for the T-track that will go on these faces. I'm routing it before I cut the faces to their final dimension. I just found that this would be a lot easier than trying to route something like this in a smaller piece. I then cut them to their final dimension, and then off camera, I drilled and countersunk a couple holes that the pins will go through. Now to attach the T-track, I can't use the screws because the screws will stick out the back. So I used some fast setting epoxy to glue these in and used a couple shims with some clamps to clamp them in there until they were completely dry. I've done this before on other projects, and it is just as secure, if not more secure, than using the provided screws. You just have to be careful that the epoxy doesn't squeeze out the screw holes because it can create a complete mess of your T-track. But as long as you take care, it works really, really well. While those were drying, it was time to get the big vacant gap taken care of in the middle of the table. So I added a door with a stopper for the front so that I would have access to this area if I really needed to. These hinges are really awesome, and they make sure that this door stays closed and doesn't just swing open at any point. And the stop was really easy to install. I just pre-drilled some holes and drilled some finishing screws right through the holes into the side. Next, I needed to add a back to that part of the cabinet. I also needed to add a dust port. So I lined up my dust port where I needed to and made some marks, marked out exactly where I needed to cut it, and then used my jigsaw to cut it. Now, don't worry, I'm not jigsawing right into my new router table. I'm actually going right into the hole of the router table that I cut earlier. Once I checked the fit to make sure that it fit properly, I added some pocket holes to the sides. Then I screwed the dust collection fitting onto the back and screwed the back into the back of the cabinet. I recessed it a little bit in there because the splitter that's going to go on the end of this needs to have a little bit of room, and I don't want it to stick out that much. After the fence was all done drying, I got everything put together. This is how everything goes together. These pins will go in the front of the faces. The faces will slide onto these grooves or slots. And then they'll be locked in place with a couple of these knobs and a washer. And it's really easy to adjust them. You're just gonna loosen the knobs, and then you can slide and open depending on how much dust collection you need and what type of router bit you're using. With the router lift in the table, I just had to see what this looked like and make sure that the opening was big enough, and sure enough, it was big enough for the throat plate. Next, I needed to add a way for the fence to be secured to the table. This is done using the back T-track and some T-screws. I just drilled a couple holes and then used a couple knobs that will allow enough pressure and secure the fence to the table. Then I added the dust port to the fence using some panhead screws, and then added the dust port splitter to the back of the table and connected the two dust ports with some 2.5-inch hose. Now on the home stretch of the project, I added my router to the router lift based on the manufacturer's directions and dropped the router lift down into the slot. I needed to drill a spot for the cord to come through, so on the back I drilled a hole using a Forstner bit to be able to pull the cord through the back of the table and connect it to my emergency stop that I attached to the side of the table here. Now, something that's really funny is this start-stop button actually did not even work. I don't know why. I've had it in my shop for a long time, and I actually bought another one for this project, not knowing that I had one laying around. So I'm gonna have to return it and see if I can figure out why. But it's really nice that I had a second one laying around, and I just decided to install that one instead of the already broken one. Next, it was time to get everything organized into the drawer, so I got all my router bits put into the router bit holder. I got all of my tools for my router lift as well as my plunge router put into the tool holders. In the shallow drawer, I put some of my jigs as well as some other accessories, and in the bottom, I put some bigger, bulkier accessories for my router. Next, it was time to test out the router table as well as the router lift. I cannot tell you how excited I was for this point. The router lift is super awesome to have. Makes it super easy to pick out a throat plate, get your bit installed, and bring that bit up to the right depth of cut. I added a little bit of finishing wax to the top so the board slid across the top like butter, and the cut was super smooth as well. Probably the thing that I'm most surprised about is how good the dust collection is with this thing. There's virtually no dust on the table. most of the dust either goes through the dust port in the fence or straight down into the cabinet below and through into the dust collector. I'm super excited to finally have this router table. This thing has been a long time coming, and I've needed a router table for a long time with a lot of the projects I'm doing. I want to say thanks to John Malecki for the build plans, and thanks to you guys for watching the video. Well, thanks again for watching. I hope you liked the video. Hope you got a lot from it. Make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. That way you'll always know when we have a new project go live at the Salt City Workshop. Again, thanks for watching, and like we always say, never stop creating.